Hello and welcome to Long Lost Tech, and today we're going to take a look at something a little different. One of my many hobbies is photography, and I've been taking pictures of things for as long as I can remember. So, after years of using little point-and-shoot cameras and my cell phone, this summer I finally got a real DSLR camera. Now, I'm not a professional photographer by any means, and I wanted something cheap to gain more experience with. So, as someone new to actual photography, this is what I got. This is the Canon Rebel XT. Released in 2005, it's definitely not on the cutting edge of technology anymore. Silver paint, crumbling rubber, and the absolutely tiny screen are all obvious markers of a device nearly 18 years old, but if you're buying a DSLR for under $50, you're probably willing to make some sacrifices. In typical LLT fashion, let's take a look at the specs first. The Canon Rebel XT has an effective resolution of 8 megapixels and uses Canon's .cr2 RAW format. The image quality is pretty solid, especially for such an old camera. It has a tendency to produce images that look a little soft, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but just something to keep in mind. The low light performance leaves a little to be desired though. The autofocus is pretty much useless unless you're shooting in broad daylight, and at higher ISO settings, things get pretty awful. Again, this isn't the end of the world, and sometimes working around limitations makes for a more enjoyable experience. For storage, the XT uses a stalwart compact flash format, which I've got plenty of experience with from all my old laptops over the years. Compact flash was the industry standard for nearly a decade, but these days it can be a little inconvenient. I got one of these cheap compact flash to SD card adapters for about $10, and it simplifies getting the files off the camera quite a bit. Your other option is to use the USB port on the left side of the Rebel XT. However, in order to get that to work, you need some old drivers that aren't particularly easy to find, and it's just easier to pull the CF card out every time than going through all that hassle. Now that we've gotten some of the specs out of the way, let's take a look around the camera itself. It's got the typical layout anyone who's used a Canon in the last 35 years will be familiar with. The shutter button and mode selector are on the right, along with the power switch and the selector wheel. On the back, you're treated to not one, but two tiny displays. The one on the top is an orange backlit LCD, used to display all the typical important stuff. Shutter speed, ISO, shots remaining, all that. The main display is used to change the camera's settings and review your images, but at just over an inch in size, it's not really all that useful for the latter. On the left side of the camera, we can see the remote connector, USB port, and AV out for connecting it to a TV or a projector. On the right, there's the flap for the compact flash card slot. Around front, we can see the infrared receiver for the wireless remote, the pop-up flash, and the lens socket. It'll accept any Canon EF or EFS lens, so you can use any of Canon's lenses back to the release of the EOS 350D film camera back in 1987. That's one of the huge advantages of buying a Canon over a Nikon or a Sony. You get nearly perfect lens compatibility with Canon's line of EOS cameras. While we're talking about the front of the camera, there's also the depth of field preview button towards the bottom left, and the flash button sits on the upper left side of the camera. On the bottom, you get the tripod mount and the battery door. I've gotten about 500 shots out of each charge on the battery. However, if you really want the maximum battery life, getting the Canon BG-E3 battery grip is a great option. This accessory slots into the battery compartment and screws into the tripod mount and provides a compartment for 2 batteries. It adds quite a bit of weight to the camera and it makes holding onto it a lot easier. The main feature, though, are the duplicated controls for taking portrait pictures. You get another shutter release, selector wheel, and buttons for the autofocus grid selector, exposure lock, and aperture priority. It's a well-built add-on and it's definitely worth getting the official Canon model. Another good investment would be a remote. A simple wired one like this makes tripod shooting a lot easier, and a wireless one is good for group photos or self-portraits. Overall, the Canon Rebel XT is a decent camera for people looking to get into DSLR photography without spending hundreds of dollars. It's old and it has its shortcomings, but if you can work around those disadvantages, you might learn a thing or two. It's important to keep in mind that a more expensive camera doesn't always mean better pictures. If you can build the fundamental skills and knowledge on a cheaper camera, you'll be better off when you upgrade to something nicer. Personally, I went from the XT to a Rebel T3, and now my main camera is this little Canon Rebel SL1. Just because I have a better camera doesn't mean I don't use the XT though. Think of it as having another tool in your arsenal. Every camera and lens will have its pros and cons. Knowing when and where to use a combination of the two is a good skill to have. People like to get super caught up in the specs and the numbers and the megapixels, but really, the best camera is the one you have with you. Thanks for watching.